Thank you. My name is Tim. I'm an alcoholic. Thank you for inviting me back. Um, and I'm here because I've been invited to be here. I'm not an authority on anything. I've just got some experience. If that experience is useful to you, that's wonderful. And if it's not, you don't need to come back next week. Feel free to disagree with anything I say. Feel free to have had different experiences. I may change my mind later today. Um, My date of sobriety is the 24th of July, 1993. Um, and I was launched into a very strong AA in London in 1993. So I'm actually going to cover Tradition 3 from a very formal point of view first. It's one of the less productive traditions in terms of working it in other areas. I'm going to cover that a little bit at the end. But just to look at the plain meaning of Tradition 3, let's read it out first. So, as with the other traditions, there is a long form and a short form, and they kind of conflict, as lots of the other traditions do, between the long form and the short form. But anyway, here, this is what they are. Short form, 3. The only requirement for AA membership is a desire to stop drinking. And then long form, our membership ought to include all who suffer from alcoholism. Hence we may refuse none who wish to recover, nor ought AA membership ever depend upon money or conformity. Any 2 or 3 alcoholics gathered together for sobriety may call themselves an AA group, provided that, as a group, they have no other affiliation. So just looking at the basic wording, to say that there's only requirement there is the only requirement means there is one requirement. Sometimes people say there are no requirements for AA membership. Well, there are, but there's just one, but there are no others. Now, AA membership, it's a funny old thing. You say, I'm an AA member, and you wait by the front door for your membership pack to be posted through the letterbox. Nothing happens. There's no badge to wear. There's no certificate. There's no little card that you can keep in your wallet with a telephone number to call for emergency assistance. Um, it's almost a meaningless notion, this idea of AA membership. You say remember once you remember, and boom, you remember. What do you get? What do you get for it? Um, and there's no procedure to become a member. There's no procedure to stop being a member. No lists kept. But there is a point to it, and it's this. Uh, Sometimes people think of AA as uh, the groups, and it's not. It's a fellowship, which is a sort of abstract. It is an abstract thing, but in practice, what being an AA member means is that because I'm an AA member, I'm an alcoholic, I get to attend meetings of groups which are for alcoholics only, so closed meetings. The term closed and open, they kept trying to change it in the UK. Last time was last year because it was confusing people on the website. Like the meeting would say it's closed, and newcomers think, oh, but they're almost all closed. Why do you have so many anyway? They decided, no, it's fine. We're going to keep calling them open and closed when we mean restricted and non-restricted attendance. Fine. But there is a meaning, and it's this, as I say, it's that I get to attend so-called closed groups for alcoholics only. Now, does that mean that uh, we can exclude anyone from an AA group? And this is a vexed question because we have a few troublemakers in London. We've always had a few troublemakers in London. The identity of those troublemakers changes over time, but the characters are pretty stable. So the question is, if there is someone behaving very unacceptably in a meeting and confounding the whole meeting because their sharing is aggressive and directed towards other people, or they're running after the girls, or they're running after the boys, or they're showing people pictures of their bits, all of that sort of stuff. What do you do? Can you exclude someone? And now, this requirement for AA membership is a requirement for AA membership. It doesn't say requirement to attend a particular meeting of a particular group at a particular point in time. So it's the practice of AA in London that group consciences in exceptional circumstances will vote to temporarily exclude or permanently exclude a member of AA. Now, does this mean we're breaking tradition 3 by doing that? Absolutely not, because in London there are almost 1,000 groups, or 1,000 meetings. There are probably around 950 groups. No one is being excluded from the fellowship. No one is being excluded from going to the other groups. They're just being excluded from going to a particular group at a particular place in a particular time. I've got friends who live in small towns and villages where there's only one group and the nearest one is hours away. Not everyone necessarily drives. If you're excluding someone from a group like that, you've got a real problem. You are effectively excluding them from the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, because it's meaningless to say I'm a member of the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous if you can't attend any groups at all. So I think how it's applied in practice will vary between urban and rural areas, and I've seen that in practice. With this notion of exclusion, though, I've seen it only absolutely exceptionally, and I've seen under particular circumstances. Firstly, where there's a grave threat to unity or primary purpose. So, as I say, predatory or violent or aggressive behaviour, or just disrupting the flow of the meeting such a lot that the meeting can't be continued. And there are several stages before a group gets to that, and one of them may be for a few people to take out the individual. I don't mean with an Uzi machine gun. I mean to take them to take, although that might be considered in some parts of the world. Uh, is you get some experienced members to sit with them outside and say, you can't, what you've been doing, you can't do that in our meeting. But we'll sit with you. We'll talk to you about AA. We'll talk to you about recovery. You want to hang around? We'll sit with you. So there are stages that you go through before excluding someone, and typically groups will have a clause where they can let the person back in after, say, 6 months. If someone is excluded for 6 months, they come back. They can ask to come back, and as long as they behave themselves, it's fine. As I say, it only applies in cities. I honestly, I have no experience of what you do in the country. If the next nearest group is 100 miles away and you've got someone who's violent or aggressive. So this brings me to the question, how does someone actually become a member of AA? And this is where we've got the long form, all who suffer from alcoholism, and that's not suffer because of it, it's suffer from it. I think the clear implication there is you have to be an alcoholic. The trouble is the short form puts us in a bit of a pickle, because it says that you can be a member if you have a desire to stop drinking. And I think it's important, but what I've been taught to do is to read the traditions, not just the words on the page, but in the context in which they were written, and looking at the intention with which they were written. So it's no good saying, well, I've done step 4. I've made up my own notion of what a fearless and thorough moral inventory is. So I've done the step 4 of AA. You may well have done a valuable exercise, but it's not the step 4 of AA unless you've done the step 4 of AA when AA says in its book, AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, the fellowship named after the book, it explains what a step 4 is. So when AA says step 4, that's what it means. And it's the same with the traditions. I think the presumption behind having a desire to stop drinking in tradition 3 is that you need to because you're an alcoholic. And that's made really clear in the long form. It's made really clear in Bill W.'s writings from the late 1940s. There's an essay from February 1948, in which Bill W. explains For the Grapevine, which was AA's magazine in America, still is, the idea behind Tradition 3. And it's very clearly about alcoholics who want to stop drinking, not any old folks who want to stop drinking. People who don't have a drink problem but want to stop drinking. That's not who this is aimed at. So our membership ought to include all who suffer from alcoholism. And you ask people in AA what's an alcoholic, and if you ask 10 people, you get 10 different answers. I think it's helpful to have a look at this little book here, see what this says about what an alcoholic is. And page 44. In the preceding chapters, you've learned something of alcoholism. We hope we have made clear the distinction between the alcoholic and the non-alcoholic. If when you honestly want to, you find you cannot quit entirely, or if when drinking you have little control over the amount you take, you're probably alcoholic. So I think that's a pretty helpful definition. And in case there was any doubt, about 15 years later, they wrote this in the 12 and 12. The tyrant alcohol wielded a double-edged sword over us. Not triple-edged, in case we're going to get into a debate of is this a twofold illness or a threefold illness, but let's not even go there. The tyrant alcohol wielded a double-edged sword over us. First, we were smitten, that's a good word, smitten, by an insane urge that condemned us to go on drinking, and then by an allergy of the body that ensured we would ultimately destroy ourselves in the process. So that's pretty heavy language. So, you're having a couple of sherries too many and you want to stop. Well, that's not what they're talking about there. However, my old home group, there was a bloke there who was a member of another fellowship. I won't say which. He was a member of another 12-step fellowship, which is a process addiction. But he said he was an alcoholic. Now, this chap didn't drink. I mean, he was Jewish, so he would have the kiddush wine on a Friday night, and he'd get drunk at Purim like everyone else. But he wasn't a drinker. But he said he was an alcoholic, and we said, you don't drink. You've never drunk. What do you mean you're an alcoholic? He said, well, I read the big book, and I really identify all the way through. And we decided, who are we to say whether or not he's allowed to identify with the big book? If he identifies with the big book as it discusses alcoholism, well, good for him. If he sees some divine purpose in coming to our group, good for him. And so this is someone that wasn't an alcoholic according to the definitions I've just given, but he decided he was, and we weren't going to make an issue out of it. Sometimes people say, well, if you do that, surely there'll be a deluge. We let him in. He started doing, so it's a closed group. He started doing service. And people were frightened that he'd get all of his friends from his different 12-step fellowship to come and do service too. Didn't happen. So the camel's nose fallacy, if you let the nose of the camel into the tent, the rest of the camel will follow. Doesn't apply here. I've not seen it applying. So those weird borderline cases where someone defines themselves as an alcoholic, says, I have a desire to stop drinking. If a group says, yes, we're not going to interfere, it's your business. I've not seen any baleful results. I've not seen the message watered down. I've not seen sudden deluges of people with other problems coming to my home groups. And in any case, someone who doesn't identify as an alcoholic can still come to any open meeting of a closed group or any open meeting of an open group. So there's no real exclusion there. What else? Yeah, there is a peculiar thing here, and this is the contradiction between the long form and the short form. The short form talks about someone having a desire to stop drinking. The long form, you'd think it would expand on that. It doesn't. It changes it. It says, we may refuse none who wish to recover. Now, to me, to my mind, wanting to stop drinking is kind of different than wanting to actually recover from alcoholism. They're connected, but they're not exactly the same thing. So, one might say, well, do you have to require both, or would either do? Bill W. in this February 1948 article is very interesting because he gives me a clear idea of what the spirit behind this was. And the spirit was one of inclusion and erecting as few barriers as possible. So I would say to anyone that wants to recover from alcoholism or wants to, whichever, either of those conditions would work. If you want to stop drinking, fine. If you want to recover from alcoholism, fine. So to interpret things broadly, to let as many people in as possible who qualify or say they qualify. Now in London, as I said, we don't really qualify people. This chap that wanted to come along and did come along to our home group, we didn't have like a ceremony to formally admit him to the group. We didn't have an interview committee. We didn't. A couple of people had a quiet word. It was generally known that, he wasn't so much of a drinker. And a couple of people said, hey, about the membership thing, do you qualify? So we didn't embarrass him in public. We didn't have we didn't set up a court. Friends of mine in other parts of the world have different experiences. And that can have good reason. I've got an acquaintance in Oregon where if someone new comes to the group, they will sit them down and qualify them as an alcoholic. And if the person is not an alcoholic, they'll give them the list of the local NA meetings or Marijuana Anonymous meetings or SLA meetings or Al-Anon meetings or whatever. So they do have a formal process and send people elsewhere. It's not the culture in the UK to do that. I think if you did that, there'd be some kind of hearing at intergroup within a month. You can do very little without an intergroup having a hearing about it. So you just got to watch yourself in this country. Woe betide a group that leaves an Al-Anon book lying around. Let me tell you, someone's gonna report it. But I understand why they do that. I've been to New York a number of times. It's not my favorite place for all sorts of reasons, and it's not my favorite place in AA. And my difficulty going to AA in New York is that it's hard to find an AA meeting. Now, that sounds like a strange thing to say because you look at the meetings list and there seem to be tens of thousands of meetings the whole time. There are venues where meetings are held all through the day. But you go, and there's this strange phenomenon. Every single person, or almost every single person, says, my name's Susan, I'm an alcoholic. My name's Peter, I'm an alcoholic. And then they talk about pills. Then they talk about drugs. Then they talk about other things. And it's pretty evident this ain't a drinker that we're listening to. This is something else. And I was at a meeting at a location which will remain undisclosed, where I think 25 people shared, and literally everyone talked about active addiction. Not one person mentioned alcohol, but every other imaginable substance was mentioned. And the question would be, if you got a newcomer who is iffy about whether or not they're an alcoholic, where do you take them if not an AA meeting? How can you tell from the meeting book what is actually an AA meeting? It's no good have it being called an AA meeting and calling yourself an alcoholic if you're not displaying the substance of that. And the reason this is relevant is because when I hear people talking about walking back from the off license with bottles full of booze and the sound of the bottles jangling giving you this sense of excitement, the glass bottles jangling against each other, or particular states of mind, particular emotional states at particular points of the evening when you're drunk. You know that moment where it goes slightly blurry and you know you're about to go into a very dark place where anything could happen, including violence and weirdness, but you just don't care anymore. And your feelings are just dead and you are invincible. And there's this invisible line that you cross. Now, one or two people are nodding, which is good. You can never expect everyone to nod at everything. But this is the point. When I hear heroin addicts or pill addicts talking about the minutiae of their using, I kind of understand it theoretically, but it has no emotional impact. And in Dr. Bob's Nightmare, he talks about relating to Bill because he understood at a gut level that this chap suffered from the same addiction. And he says because he experienced it, not because he'd read about it in a book. And that vital element of identification is the only thing that AA has going for it as a unique characteristic. Everything else we pinched, we begged, borrowed, or stole from somewhere else. Yet that we combined it, but that's the special ingredient. So it's the ingredients in the pot, fine, but you need heat under the pot for the contents of the pot to cook, and the heat is the identification. So I totally get why in certain parts of America, some groups qualify alcoholics to come in because not every group, in fact, very few groups are AA groups in the sense of being comprised chiefly of alcoholics and having alcoholism as opposed to addiction more generally as their chief focus. A similar thing happens in London in terms of groups where they're AA groups. People identify as alcoholics, and probably they are. But the primary purpose of the group is to talk about what you think about what you felt over the last 7 days. Again, it looks like an AA group. And hooray that those groups exist. If they're there, they're probably helping people. So wonderful. But I need there to be groups which focus on alcoholism. And there's a really simple way in London to find groups which do, is you go down the meeting list. If the meeting is based on the AA literature, the Big Book or the 12 and 12 or As Bill Sees It or something else, there's a really large chance that the people there believe that that is how you recover from alcoholism and that is your problem, that is your solution. If it's an open discussion group, it's the conscience of that group that the way to recover from your problem is to just discuss anything. People are allowed to believe that. That's totally fine. But it's part of my duty in AA in London to make sure that there are groups available which people can go to discuss alcoholism, to discuss recovery from that. What else? It also says in the long form, AA membership, nor ought AA membership ever depend upon money or conformity. And indeed, conformity comes in all sorts of different ways. So we've got the ordinary understanding of tradition 3, which is if you say you're an alcoholic, if you say you have a desire to stop drinking, if you say you want to recover, come in, you're one of us, we're all equal, everyone has one share, take a seat, here's a broom. Now, it's not good enough for my home group just to be doing that. We've got to make sure that no one feels excluded either. Bill's overall intention was to be as inclusive as possible in tradition 3, inclusive of anyone who suffers from alcoholism. And to do that, I've got to be alert to things which could be perceived as excluding people. After any group of mine, which is a home group, where we go for fellowship afterwards, if it's held physically in the real world, we go for dinner afterwards. We choose the cheapest restaurant around, where the waiters don't mind if people don't eat. You know, those big tables where, you know, 2/3 of the people are eating, the other third aren't. There's no cover charge. You don't get waiters looking down their nose at people for just having a glass of water with a bit of splendor in it. Um, it People have got to feel that they're allowed to be there and that there isn't a barrier to entry. I've been at meetings where a bunch of people go out for dinner afterwards, and the restaurant they choose to go to is like £30 a head, which a lot of people can't afford. We're not telling people we're excluding them, but we're acting like we're excluding them. Not on. Second thing that's just not on, and if you disagree with me on this, hard luck. No dress codes. Stop with the dress codes. If you wear whatever you want to the meeting, be who you are. If you can't be who you are at the meeting, effectively, you are being excluded. I don't need to say any more about that. Religion or lack of it. So AA goes to great lengths. So if you have, this is going to be contentious. If you have a meeting on step 2 or step 3 or step 11, or basically anything where God is mentioned, if the chair mentions God, you normally get 4 or 5 people doing long apologies after the chair for the mention of God and reiterating again and again and again, it doesn't have to be God, you don't have to believe in God, it can be a God of your understanding, it can be a higher power, your higher power can be a tree stump, you can do whatever you, and that's great. We want to make sure that someone that comes in like really, really touchy about religion is not going to be turned off. This is the contentious bit. Would that we extended the same courtesy to newcomers who are religious. So you'll hear people from the chair saying, I'm a recovering Catholic. Ha 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 ha. So, and then the rest of the group laughs. And I've heard Catholic newcomers after the first meeting saying, I'm not going to come back. This place is clearly hostile to Catholicism, and I'm a practicing Catholic. I'm not welcome here. So I think that one goes both ways. So I've been at meetings where someone mentions God, and some old timer says, if I'd heard that when I first came in, I would have walked straight out. And people are chastised publicly for talking about God and the higher power in meetings. I was at a meeting where someone talked about God during their share in a not trying to force it on anyone else, but just talking about their own experience. And the person sitting behind them, immediately behind them, said, when I hear people talking about God, it makes me want to stick pins in their eyes. Now, imagine reversing this with atheism or with anything else. It would be totally unacceptable, but it's culturally acceptable in AA to be disparaging of religion, to be disparaging of people that believe in God, to be disparaging of the religion itself, and to mock it. So I think the courtesy and tolerance has to be absolutely universal, whether one thinks it's arrant nonsense or not. I get to believe what I want and share what I want. You get to believe what you want and share what you want. And as long as it's done with courtesy and respect for other people's views, that's absolutely fine. Other things which exclude people. So we're talking about tradition 3, not excluding people. A very common format around the world is someone speaks for 20 minutes or so, and then the group opens for sharing, and there are 40 people in the room, and 10 people share. And the 10 people who share are 10 home group members who spend most of the share lavishing extortionate praise on the chair and saying how much they love them and how helpful they've been and how much they've grown since they came in, and about the time we went to Corfu and how, oh, it's all fun together. And that's fine, except when that's basically what most of the meeting is. How are people going to feel if that's their first meeting? This looks like a private club where we massage each other's egos. So tradition 12 really feeds into tradition 3 here. If I want this to be genuinely open to everyone, I've got to have the same distance to anyone else who's sharing. I've seen couples in AA, man, wife, husband, wife, where they're both in the room, one does the chair, the other one shares back. You would not know they were married. Sponsor and sponsee, same thing. Never ever say to the sponsor who's doing the chair or the sponsee that's, I've been working with you for all these years. They might not want their anonymity broken. You might want to tell them that you have a sponsor-sponsee relationship with them. They may not be so chuffed about it. So have the courtesy to allow other people to be private at the public level so that everyone is on the same level. The social distance, if I can use the phrase, the social distance between any two people in the room is the same. Any cliquishness, the biggest complaint about strong AA groups I've seen is that they're cliquey. And a lot of that cliquiness comes from over-familiar sharing, which is all about the relationship between the two people, the sharer and the shared at, and not about the subject matter. So it should be principles, not personalities. It should not matter who is in the chair. What else? It's got to be, it's very important to, I believe, at my home group, to make sure that if people are new, we haven't seen them, to go and talk to them, go and find out where they're from. Is this their first meeting? I mean, sometimes you have to ask that and they're really offended and say, well, no, actually, I've been sober for 15 years, but, thanks. So people get very aggressive if you ask them if it's their first meeting. Like you're supposed to know instinctively just by their whole comportment. Their whole deportment shouts that should be shouting that this is a man with a real answer. But anyway, you have to risk that. Like if they're 15 years sober and they have resentment, they can get over it. They can, as my other half who isn't even in AA says, they can write a column, can't they? Because we've got to look after the people who are new. Sometimes with my other half, when he sets a boundary with me and I pull a face, he said, what are you going to do? Write a column? Anyway, so we've got to welcome people in reality, not just in principle. I'd rather people are overwelcomed than underwelcomed. Now, what this means is we've got to be as welcoming to people who are ugly or smelly or drunk or old or weird. If you're in one of those categories and you go to most meetings, people will form of, you want social distancing, go to a meeting and displaying one of those characteristics, there'll be this huge gap of chairs around you. And it's wrong. I used to have a home group around 20 years ago. When they went for dinner, maybe there were 60 people at the meeting, maybe 10, 15 would go for dinner. There was this little group of people who were sober a long time that would pick the attractive and witty and debonair newcomers. But if you didn't look like you'd fit in at the restaurant they were going to, you'd never get invited. It's not fellowship unless everyone is invited. If not everyone is invited, it's something else. It's not a bad thing, but it's not fellowship. If I'm going for dinner with a friend after a meet, and this is a very important point, when I'm going for dinner after a meeting with a friend, my best friend is in AA, and we usually go to the same home. We do go to the same home group. And a few months ago, he was really upset during the meeting for some reason. He couldn't face going for fellowship afterwards. So we decided to go off and have dinner together and not go with the group. Now, when people said, are you coming for fellowship? The answer is not, I'm going for dinner with my friend, or I'm going for fellowship with my friend. No. I'm not available for fellowship this evening. The fact I am going off with another AA member afterwards is irrelevant. There mustn't be multiple tiers of fellowship and groups within circles and like exclusive little clubs. Either I'm at fellowship or I'm not at fellowship. If I'm not at, and we would go to a restaurant miles away so that we're not running into people. There must be no sense of like special little groups afterwards. If I'm not available afterwards, I'm not available. Sometimes, and this is, I think, an occupational hazard of strong groups. At strong groups, people tend to get well eventually, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly. You have to kind of grit your teeth while we're all waiting for that to happen, but nonetheless, eventually it happens. And people get to know each other, people form strong bonds, and newcomers come in, and the accusation is it's cliquey. It's not cliquey. What they're observing is people know each other. And this challenge, if you haven't had a good friend in 10 years, this will be challenging. Seeing people being nice to each other is going to look like you're being excluded. So this has got to be actively combated. I'm very aware if I'm standing around having coffee with a bunch of people by the counter before a meeting or at fellowship afterwards, I look for the person that is least included and actively but subtly try to include them in the conversation. Exactly the same at the dinner table afterwards. And this is something which is not practiced by many people at fellowship. Mostly what happens at fellowship is a couple of people dominate the conversation and fuck everyone else. So I try and make sure that everyone is excluded. If I'm on a long table, I've got 5 people round me, one opposite, one left, one right, and 2 on either corner. I give equal time to all 5. So although the fellowship afterwards is not formally part of the meeting, I try to carry that principle of maximal inclusion to fellowship afterwards. And the reason for this is all set out in the February 1948 article, which is in the book Language of the Heart, February 1948, Bill W., where he says that alcoholics are rebels, nonconformists, and bankrupt idealists, and that barriers can be fatal to alcoholics. People are unable and unwilling to conform, and they're as he puts it, too weak and confused to jump the hurdles. So it's not a matter of meeting these newcomers halfway, it's going all the way into the dark cave to try and connect them in a meeting setting. It talks in Tradition 3 about any 2 or 3 alcoholics. What does it say? Any 2 or 3 alcoholics gathered together for sobriety may call themselves an AA group, provided that as a group they have no other affiliation. So this gets tricky. This is all tricky as well. Now it says any 2 or 3 alcoholics. The 3 is completely redundant because once you've got 2, you've met the requirement. So I don't know why it says 3. But it says any 2 or 3 alcoholics gathered together. So there's got to be some coming together there. And the implication is that it's some regular coming together. One problem I've got with clubhouses and their equivalent, if you've been to meetings in America, you'll have come across clubhouse meetings, and you look at the directory, you think, oh, this is lovely. Look, they've got 10 meetings a day. How marvelous. And you go along, and this is not often the meeting rooms are very big with like 150 chairs, and there are 10 people in the room sitting as far away from each other as is possible to sit, and no one is saying hello to anyone else. And there's no sense that this is not a group. A group is not a place. A group is a bunch of people that have a spiritual connection and become a spiritual entity. So there's got to be some commitment there for it to be a group. With secondary purposes, so the group must have the primary purpose of sobriety. And obviously you have particular meetings which address other topics, like a particular step. Or there's a group that's recently formed in London which has been set up to discuss sex and sexual identity. But it's an AA group. Now, the difficulty there, I know, well, it's fine. If they want to do that, it's absolutely fine. But here's the problem. So if a group is established there for sobriety, it can hold individual meetings which are on particular topics without confounding that ultimate purpose of sobriety. But as soon as something else becomes the primary focus, sobriety is no longer the primary focus, and that betrays itself in the content of the group. And so those are real borderline situations in my view. And it says also, provided that they have no other affiliation. Affiliation is a very misunderstood word in AA. The sense of it, the dictionary sense of it, is some kind of formal association with another organization. So if your meeting is held in St. Joseph's Catholic Church, you have no formal association with them. You're cooperating with them at arm's length. They're a service provider to you. You're not affiliated. I mean, to underline that, a group should not call itself the St. Joseph's Catholic Church meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, because that does imply affiliation. So you've got affiliation in the sense of structural connection. That must be avoided. But also, if you look at the background material to Tradition 3, it talks about not professing as part of the group's identity a particular faith or a particular political persuasion. So I think Bill says, let's see if I can find it. One can think of no AA member who would like, for example, to see the formation of dry AA groups, wet AA groups, Republican AA groups, or communist AA groups. Few, if any, would wish our groups to be designated by religious denominations. We cannot lend the AA name even directly to other activities, however worthy. So those are the two aspects of not having any affiliation: no structural connection to another organisation, and no perception of one by professing allegiance to a particular belief or a particular ideology. And this does, I think it's a problem with special interest groups, which I had a special interest group as my home group for a good 14 years in AA. So um, uh, um, my views are mixed on special interest groups. And what are special interest groups? Groups for men, groups for women, gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, blah, blah, blah groups, atheist and agnostic groups, and so on. So that's what a special interest group is. I think this is a matter on which reasonable people of goodwill disagree. I've heard very good arguments on both sides. And just to present what those are, some of these I hold, and some of these I'm a bit wavering on. In favour of them, in a northern city in the UK, they started a gay group, and the reason why is because so many people who are gay were experiencing overt homophobia in other meetings, and that was effectively excluding them from AA. To be a member of AA, they had to set up a special interest group. I've heard women express similar things with misogynistic meetings with a very dark, threatening male energy, and I've seen that. People who've suffered particularly at the hands of men, or straight people, will need a safe place for a while to learn how to trust again. It's certainly the case if you've been to men's meetings, you'll hear. I've not been to a women's meeting. If you go to men's meetings, you'll hear stuff shared. You won't hear shared elsewhere, let me tell you. So the candor can be stifled if everyone can be there. And Tradition 3 is about removing barriers. So the intention behind Tradition 3 is that you're supposed to remove barriers. If your different identity forms a barrier, the existence of a special interest group can actually help you to belong. It's not excluding you, it's helping you to belong. But they're not without difficulties, and my experience reflects these. So I used to belong to this gay group in London for many years, and Some people went to just loads of ordinary meetings as well, but some people only went to gay meetings and perceived AA as a whole as like an entirely different organization and retained a sense of suspicion and hostility because they never actually experienced ordinary AA. So this kind of phantom of the evil of ordinary AA was perpetuated because of the existence of the special interest groups. So it helps on one level, but it can actually perpetuate the problem that it's supposed to try and resolve. Next problem. If you extract all of the gays and lesbians out of ordinary groups and pop them in the gay groups, suddenly you have these ordinary groups which don't anymore reflect the population as a whole, because all the young people have been sucked out and go to the young people's meetings. All the gays and lesbians are sucked out and go to the GLBT meetings. Women are going to women's meetings. There are far more women's meetings than there are men's meetings generally. And so you go to it, particularly in the suburbs, because people travel into town for the special interest groups generally. You go to a meeting in a suburb, and it's much more likely to be skewed towards men, skewed towards people who are older, skewed towards people who are white, skewed towards people who are straight. So it's actually that the special interest groups can be part of causing the problem of AA not matching the surrounding demographic, so that when someone is sent to their local AA meeting in a suburb, they don't know that all of the minorities have been sucked out into special interest groups, and they think this is AA. AA is not for me. I have a moral responsibility to go to my nearest AA meeting because I'm part of this community, so that my AA group reflects who is in the community. Yes, I might go to some other meetings too, but I've got to be careful of the effect of that. It's always been very contentious in the UK. Every 10 years or so, there's some slightly shrewish motion at conference about excluding special interest groups from the meetings listing. It's probably going to come up forever. And there's a sort of fig leaf that they have on the labeling of special interest groups, which it says in the meetings listing, non-restrictive, which means anyone gets to come. And that's fine. And I've seen that certainly at gay meetings. No one's actually asking. They even have a sign up at one that I go to sometimes where it says, don't assume anyone's sexuality or gender when they come in. And people don't have to tell you what their sexuality or gender is. So don't even ask. Uh, if you want to be here, you can be here. I think that's not bad. Where it becomes a fig leaf, however, and this is super contentious, so, take it for what it is. Young persons AA conventions. To get round the fact that basically they're exclusive and they are for young people, the language is manipulated, in my experience. And what people say, what's young? Well, you got sober below 30. I mean, I got sober at 21. You got sober below 30, or you're currently below 30. Now, that's an exclusion. I mean, it's very clearly a breach of Tradition 3. Not everyone is. There's a requirement for membership of that convention, as it goes against Tradition 3. The way they get round that is they say that young is, and these are the phrases I've heard, is you still have room for growth or you're young at heart. I'm not young at heart. What's wrong with being old at heart? And room to grow, I mean, essentially, it's stripping the notion of any meaning whatsoever. And I'm afraid, to my mind, it's a little bit Orwellian. Everyone is welcome, but some people are more welcome than others. All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. So, like, anyone can be here, but actually it's for young people. So if it's skewed young, you're effectively excluding people, like in terms of who's actually there. If it's skewed young, the older people, I've heard older people at young people's conventions say they don't feel as though they belong because that suddenly they're in this minority. So if it works and largely young people come, you're excluding a whole bunch of people. If it doesn't work and it reflects the demographics of AA as a whole, what's the point in it even being young person's convention? Now, there are good arguments for young people's conventions too, and I'll let the young people's conventions people present those. This is not a settled matter. These are just my personal views. I think the difficulty, this always happens, in my experience in special interest groups or special interest parts of AA, it's inevitable that one develops an identity, and my ego attaches to that identity, and there's us over here and them over there. And you see that with I mentioned it before, branding of like Big Book Awakenings and Primary Purpose Group and Big Book Step Study and all of those Fellowship of the Spirit brandings in America. But you have the brandings at young people's conventions as well of the special rites and customs. So the chanting, there's a particular chanting that can happen at some of them. Additions to the traditions, which and some of them there are a couple of them which are unspeakably rude to my view when they talk about special workers, and there's an impression done of people who are handicapped, and that actually happens. I've had friends go that feel totally freaked out by that ritualistic behavior because it feels like they've joined a cult. And it's the same with any chanting in AA. Chanting of the whether it's we think not at the end of the promises or any other form of chanting makes us look like a cult, and it doesn't. It's not helping anyone who's new to be included. And my experience is that special interest bits of AA seem, in my view, much more prone to that ritualistic behavior, which excludes people who are not part of that little group. And that ritualistic behavior is there to establish like this separate identity. And so I feel that I'm just an AA member. My group is an ordinary AA group, and I'm a member of the Worldwide Fellowship of AA. And in Al-Anon, they always say that I'm a member of the Worldwide Fellowship of the Al-Anon family groups, and I love that. There's no us and them. There's no formation of special identity. There's just being dissolved into the whole. But these are matters on which people disagree, and Bill W., who always gets the last word on anything. Just a couple of points before the last word on that topic is, although there are issues there are very few special interest groups in London. Their existence doesn't damage AA as a whole. They clearly help loads of people, so hooray. But there are issues, but hooray. Bill W. said, when someone wanted to form a gay group in the 1940s, I think in Boston. I think this is Barry L. told this story. I don't have it documented, but I've heard it on tapes. Bill said to the people that wanted to form it, "Are you willing to go to any lengths to stay sober?" They said yes. He said, "Do you think this is a length you need to go to stay sober?" They said yes. He said, "You have my blessing, go and form the group." So that's Bill. So Bill has the last word. Couple of other points. In the 1948 essay, Bill W. says, in Alcoholics Anonymous, there are no musts, and that's absolutely true. Sometimes this gets slightly distorted to suggest that the program has no musts. And people go to very great lengths. Mark Houston and Joe Hawke would do it in the 1990s of listing all the places in the big book where it says you must do this and must do that, and it's a fun gag for about 15 minutes. But there's an important idea here that I've got to allow people to feel totally welcome in my home group, even if they don't do the steps. Even if there's no conformity, you don't have to believe anything, you don't have to do anything. And my view is I always look at it like this, that the steps are like a vending machine. If AA is a common room or something, the steps are like a vending machine in the corner. No one must use the vending machine, but if you don't pop your penny in at the top, you won't get the fizzy pop out of the bottom. And so I won't get the results of taking the steps unless I take the steps. That's the level at which the must kicks in. but no one is forcing me to take the steps. And that's the freedom that I think we give people in AA. Step 3 in other domains. I think I mentioned last time, I think it was Mary Pearl, I may be wrong on that, who did one of the first worksheets on applying the traditions in relationships. And the rewording of tradition 3 for marriage was there are no requirements for this marriage except the desire to be in the marriage and to make it work, which is very interesting. So not to be in there as a sort of internal saboteur. I don't know if any of you have ever experienced this, but I've been in relationships where my purpose of being in the relationship, it looks like I want to be in the relationship, but my real relationship is to sabotage it or to sabotage the other person. And I dance around it so carefully. It doesn't look like that's what I'm doing, but that's what I'm doing. And this is where it kicks in my real life, is that in any meaningful relationship in my life, it's got to proceed on good faith. In the same way as my AA group, as long as someone doesn't confound the very purpose of the group by their aggressive behavior or predatory behavior or disruption, they're acting in good faith. And provided you're acting in good faith, knock yourself out. Be who you are. Do what you want. In sponsorship, this is a totally relevant fact. I don't know if any of you have experienced this, but I've experienced sponsees where they call for help and their words are those of someone who wants help. You know, this is the problem. Can I have some help? What do I do? How do I apply the program? And then you offer some banal suggestion like, oh, just let go or pray or go to a meeting or do an inventory or, stand in the corner and think very hard about what you've done. Whatever the suggestion is. And you get the 4 R's. What are the 4 R's? The 4 R's are reaction, resistance, rejection, reproach. So you've barely even explained which step you're going to suggest they apply to the situation. Already they're react, interrupt. And then they resist every aspect of it with wheedling and then they reject outright what you're saying, and then they tell you off for suggesting something that they don't like, which they asked for, but now it's I remember one person said to me, please leave me alone. I'm like, you called me. So I'm much quicker at spotting that bullshit now and saying, sweetheart, I love you, but I don't think you want what this relationship is about. But I want you as my sponsor. No, you want the notion of me as your sponsor. That's what you want. The sponsorship is the directions. You don't want the directions. You want the notion of me as a sponsor. And it's the same as this tradition 3, is I have to want sobriety, not the idea of sobriety. Not I'm in and you're, this is something I did. I've seen other people do it. For a while, I was coming to AA to make it look like I was doing something about my drinking, so I didn't have to feel guilty about the fact that I was drinking most of the time. So the whole thing was a fig leaf. And if you've got sponsees that are super willing, super effective, drunk, super willing, super effective, I'll do anything. And for like 4 days, they do everything that you suggest, like to the tenfold, and then they disappear for 48 hours. And then you hear about them a week later and they call and they say, I've let you down, I've let AA down, I've let myself. And this goes round and round for years. There's got to be a sincere desire to make it work for its own sake. And it's the same with sponsorship relationships. When I realize there's something else going on, I'm done. When I realize that the purpose of this deal, whatever it is not what it says on the tin, we're done. So, and the last point, so I'm just coming up to 60 minutes on this. And I think this is the big spiritual punchline in tradition 3. So there is no requirement for membership other than a desire to stop drinking. Plus, I should have no requirement of AA or recovery other than it deliver sobriety. As soon as I require that sobriety, that more than sobriety be delivered, as soon as I require that AA or God or life or the universe or the government deliver me whatever, a career, a relationship, happiness, peace, any of those things. As soon as I don't have those, I'm going to drink. And it was only when I said to AA in July 1993, if I'm never happy, fine. If I never have a job, fine. If I never have a career, if I never have a stable place to live, fine. I just want to be sober. Miraculously, I stopped relapsing. Isn't that a funny thing? So I've got to have one. I make AA's primary purpose my primary purpose, which is to stay sober and help other alcoholics to achieve sobriety. That's the only requirement. And to do that, uh, that is indirect. My direct thing is to establish a relationship with God. If my only desire is to establish a relationship with God, everything else flows from that. My identity is secure. My purpose is secure. Nothing can fail. And that's where my security lies today. So that lack of requirement goes two ways. AA doesn't require anything of me other than the sincere desire to stay sober. And I don't require of anything of AA or the world other than it keep me sober, provided I keep my nose clean. I'm going to stop there, Gabrielle. I don't know if you want to carry on for a couple of minutes, in case anyone does have a question. Okay, I'll whip through those. The recording won't pick up. The recording is through the microphone on my computer. It won't pick up anything you've said, so I'm going to have to repeat. I'm going to have to read out the questions. So just be aware of that as well. So the first one, and I'll try and answer these as quickly as possible. What about non-alcoholics working with others, i.e. working with newcomer alcoholics? Uh, I've not seen that work. I've got to have identification. Now, it's messy because most people come to AA with more than one problem. I've got to have a point of identification. So I have an array of addictive substances and patterns. Every sponsee has an array of addictive substances and patterns, but there's got to be one, at least one, where we cross over. If we don't have that one, then we can't get that visceral identification. Without the visceral identification, I find people don't trust me. I don't trust people unless I have a visceral identification with them. So there are enough alcoholics in AA to sponsor the alcoholics, in my experience. If a group does not participate in the general service structure, is it still considered an official AA meeting? Well, according to tradition 3, yes. You can do what you want. You 2 or 3 alcoholics gather together for the purposes of sobriety. There are groups in London which eschew the service structure, stick 2 fingers up at it, say it's all corrupt, and it's fine. It's fine. Um, uh, are groups bound to apply the traditions? Um, the only point I think the main point at which the traditions kick in there is tradition 4. So within the bounds of your 4 walls, knock yourself out unless you're affecting AA as a whole. Now, a group which just ignores the service structure and won't have anything to do with it, won't send a GSR to intergroup, nothing like that, generally won't harm the AA structure. The only way it can do that is if it gets weird and newcomers come along and people sit them down and pat their damp little hands and say, unless you find Jesus, you're not going to get well. Now that affects AA as a whole because people coming to AA get the impression that that is AA. So I've got to be careful at my home group that we're presenting an accurate picture of the fellowship of AA as a whole are not that we don't want to weird people out with our own little gimmicks and quirks. That's the point at which it might become the business of AA as a whole, what our group is doing. So we keep squeaky clean on that to make sure that we don't become part of any public controversy within AA. Meetings in Perth are beginning to open again, but with COVID-19 conditions, contact tracing is a requirement from venues. Does this, in your view, conflict with membership requirements? All indoor meetings are affected. I, this touches on a number of different traditions. It obviously touches on anonymity, um, but the anonymity questions we'll cover that later on. But the essential notion of anonymity is public anonymity at the level of press, radio, TV, and film. There is a general principle of anonymity, which is all about humility and recognizing that what we have comes from God. Anything I know, every single thing I said today came originally from someone else. And I went, oh, that makes sense. I'll have that. And that's the anonymity. Nothing comes from me. But anonymity in the strict sense is so that we don't display ourselves publicly. It's not about necessarily about anonymity at community level. In terms of, Dr. Bob talked about this, that people ought to be able to find you in your community. If you're so positioned that you don't want anyone to know you're an AA, that's fine. But that's your own business. But you're not breaching the principle of anonymity to enable yourself to be contact traced, in my view. Just a view. Regarding requirements from venues, most venues have, if you've signed a venue lease, you've signed all sorts of agreements. So you're not allowed to bring dogs or hamsters or gerbils or carpies into the room. Your children have to be kept on a chain. You're not allowed to spill any liquids anywhere. You've got to lock things 3 times, call the police if there's an intruder. There are so many things that you have to do. This might be one of those things. There are ways round that, as if these are venue requirements. Some groups in London, I'm given to understand, are meeting in parks observing social distancing. Now, whether or not that's actually effective from a epidemiological point of view because of wind direction is another question. Let's say if you're 2 meters away from someone and you're downwind of them, it's not 2 meters, it's like you've got them in your face. But anyway, there are ways of avoiding venues. There are ways of meeting. You can meet in people's houses. So there are ways around that if people are twitchy. In London, I don't know what's happening. We haven't really started to think about opening up again. But I am going to be continuing to hold online groups because there are people that are going to need to be shielded for years properly, probably. So we want to make sure they're looked after. So I think that covers that. To me, that covers the question. If you're enabling people to find recovery, you're fine. Any other questions, Gabrielle? Good. Okay, thank you. Well, I think I'm done there now.